There's a piece of advice that has survived every generation of marriage counseling, every self-help bestseller, every grandmother's kitchen table conversation, and it is quietly doing damage in relationships right now. Accept your partner for who they are. It sounds like grace. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's the most sophisticated way people have ever learned to stop asking for what they need. Margaret and Roy Chen have been married for 61 years. They met in 1963 at a church social in Pasadena. Roy was playing guitar badly, Margaret was pretending not to notice. They raised 4 children, buried one of them, survived Roy's layoff in 1982 and Margaret's cancer diagnosis in 2009, and they will tell you, with the kind of calm that only 6 decades can produce, that the secret to their marriage is simple: you have to accept the person God gave you. Stop trying to change them. And they mean it. You can see it in the way Roy reaches for Margaret's hand before she finishes her sentences. You can see it in the way Margaret laughs at his jokes even though she's heard them all. This is not performance. This is something that was built, slowly, over a very long time. But here is what we owe them, and ourselves, before we take that advice and carry it back to our own lives. Margaret and Roy formed their belief inside a specific world. A world where divorce carried genuine social shame, where a woman's financial independence was, for most of Margaret's adult life, not a realistic option, and where the psychological language we now use to describe incompatibility, attachment styles, emotional unavailability, unmet needs, values misalignment, simply did not exist in the mainstream. Accept your partner was also, for many people in that era, a quiet instruction to survive. Not to thrive. To survive. That distinction matters more than it might seem. And that's exactly what this video is going to hold. We are going to honor what Margaret and Roy got profoundly right about acceptance, because they got a lot right, and we're going to update what modern psychology, modern gender dynamics, and modern relationship research tell us gets dangerously misread. By the end, you'll have a framework that separates the acceptance that builds love from the acceptance that slowly erases you. 5 principles, drawn from their 61 years, translated for a world they never lived in. The first thing they said, the very first, was this: the sooner you stop expecting them to be different, the happier you'll both be. Let's start there. Margaret said it without hesitation: the way you say something you've tested against reality so many times it has become fact. The moment I stopped waiting for Roy to become someone else, I started actually seeing who he was. And who he was enough. Roy nodded at this, slowly, the way men of his generation nod when a woman has said the true thing before they could find the words for it. What they're describing is a real psychological shift, and it is not small. The move from fantasy partner to actual partner is one of the most important transitions a long-term relationship requires. In the early stages of love, what researchers call the limerence phase, your brain is quite literally constructing an idealized version of the person in front of you. You are not seeing them. You are projecting. Margaret and Roy are saying, at some point, that has to end. And they are right. The context, though, is important. Margaret made this psychological shift in an era when the alternative, leaving, carried an enormous social and financial cost that simply no longer exists in the same way. The acceptance she found may have been, in part, an adaptation to constrained options. That doesn't make what she built less beautiful. It makes it more complicated than a bumper sticker. Psychologist Carl Rogers, the architect of person-centered therapy, described something he called unconditional positive regard A radical acceptance of another person that doesn't require them to perform or improve in order to be loved. Decades of therapeutic research have validated this as genuinely transformative. When people feel seen without conditions, they paradoxically become more capable of growth, not less. So Margaret's instinct is supported. But Rogers was describing a therapeutic stance between a counselor and a client, not a blank check issued to a partner who is harming you. Here is the updated principle: acceptance is not the absence of expectation. It is the decision to see your partner clearly, and then choose them anyway. The key word is clearly. What Margaret and Roy said next connects directly to this, and it complicates it in exactly the right way. Roy said this one. He leaned forward when he said it, which is how you know it cost him something to learn. He described a period in their late 30s. The children were young, money was tight, he was working doubles at the plant, where he and Margaret became, in his words, two people sharing a house. Not hostile. Not dramatic. Just absent from each other. I almost lost her to nothing, he said. Not to another man. To nothing. This is one of the most underreported relationship risks that modern research has since confirmed with remarkable consistency. John Gottman, who has spent over 4 decades studying couples at his Love Lab in Seattle, identifies what he calls turning toward versus turning away as one of the most reliable predictors of relationship longevity. It's not the grand gestures. It's the small daily bids for connection, a comment about the weather, a hand on a shoulder, a question about your partner's day, and whether your partner meets them or misses them. Roy and Margaret stumbled into this truth empirically through a near miss in 1984. The context layer here is worth naming. Roy's absence during those years was, in part, structurally produced. He was working in an economy that demanded physical presence as proof of male value. He was operating inside a masculinity script that did not include the sentence, "I feel distant from you and it frightens me." The turning away was not cruelty. It was armor. Modern couples face a different version of this same erosion, and in some ways a harder one. The distractions are not just overwork. They are algorithmic, infinite, and designed by some of the most sophisticated engineers in human history to compete with your partner for your attention. Roy lost Margaret temporarily to exhaustion and economic pressure. Your relationship may be losing ground to a phone screen every single night, in increments too small to feel like a decision. The updated principle, growing together, is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a practice you maintain, in the smallest moments, on the most ordinary days, especially when nothing is wrong, because that is exactly when the distance starts. Margaret delivered this one with the authority of someone who has enforced it as household policy for 6 decades. She described early arguments, about money, about Roy's mother, about whose turn it was to be patient, where they would sit at the kitchen table past midnight, sometimes past 2 in the morning, not leaving until something had shifted. We were tired, she said, but we were still us. You go to sleep angry, you wake up strangers. There is something genuinely wise buried in this. What Margaret is really describing is a refusal to let rupture become the default, a commitment to repair that many modern couples, frankly, lack the tolerance to practice. The instinct not to let distance calcify overnight is sound. Repair matters. Gottman's research confirms it. Couples who repair early and often are dramatically more stable than those who let grievances accumulate. But here is where we have to be honest, and where the framing needs a significant update. When Roy says never go to bed angry, he is working from an emotional vocabulary that, for most of his adult life, contained approximately one entry, anger. For men of his generation, anger was the only feeling that came with social permission. What he often called anger, what kept them up until 2 in the morning, may well have been fear, or grief, or shame, or longing. He didn't have the language. Very few men in 1971 did. So they fought about the surface thing, exhausted themselves into resolution, and called it working it out. Modern neuroscience tells a more nuanced story. When a person reaches what researcher John Gottman calls flooding, a state of physiological overwhelm where the heart rate exceeds 100 beats per minute, the brain's capacity for empathy, nuance, and rational processing shuts down. You are not solving anything at that table at 2 a.m. You are two flooded nervous systems performing the ritual of resolution. Research on sleep and emotional regulation, including work published by Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley, consistently shows that REM sleep actively processes emotional experience, that the brain, overnight, can genuinely reduce the charge of a painful memory. Sometimes sleep is not avoidance. Sometimes sleep is the most sophisticated de-escalation tool available to you. The updated principle, don't go to bed with contempt unaddressed, but don't confuse exhausted combat with genuine repair. Sometimes the bravest thing you can say is, I love you, I'm not okay right now, and I need to sleep before I can do this right. There is something else worth naming before we move on. Margaret and Roy built this particular habit, sitting at the kitchen table until resolution, in a home where Margaret was not employed outside of it. Her time, in an economic sense, was structured differently than Roy's. The midnight conversation was costly for both of them, but the morning alarm belonged to one of them in a way it did not belong to the other. Fewer than a quarter of American households today are structured around a single income. For dual-income couples, especially those with children, the 2 a.m. resolution session is not romantic. It is a setup for two people to be impaired at work the next day. The wisdom has to be adapted to the actual material conditions of the people trying to use it. Margaret and Roy's advice is not wrong. It was built for a floor plan that most of us no longer live in. Roy said this one quietly, almost to himself, and then laughed. He was describing a version of himself from the first decade of their marriage, a man who was convinced that Margaret's way of organizing the kitchen, managing money, expressing worry, and greeting strangers was slightly, correctably wrong. I thought I was helping, he said. I was just telling her she wasn't enough. This is, without question, the most universally applicable thing Roy said in the entire conversation. And it maps directly onto one of the most robust findings in modern relationship psychology. Gottman identifies criticism, not conflict, but criticism, the attack on character rather than behavior, as the first of his 4 horsemen, the 4 communication patterns most predictive of relationship failure. The distinction Roy is drawing between having a concern and treating your partner as a deficiency to be corrected is exactly the distinction between a complaint and a criticism. I feel overwhelmed when the finances aren't tracked is a complaint. You're just irresponsible with money is a criticism. One opens a door. The other locks it. Where Roy's framing requires updating is in the word project. Because there is a version of this advice, except that you married a person, not a project, that gets weaponized. It gets used to shut down legitimate requests for growth. You knew who I was when you married me is Roy's wisdom turned into a shield. And there is a real difference between trying to renovate your partner's personality and asking your partner to show up more fully for the relationship you're both in. Acceptance is not the same as silence. Loving someone as they are does not mean pretending their patterns aren't affecting you. Sue Johnson, the developer of emotionally focused therapy, frames it this way: Healthy attachment requires both acceptance and responsiveness. You must feel loved as you are, and you must feel that your partner is capable of responding to your needs. A marriage that has only one of those things is not secure. It is either suffocating or lonely. The updated principle: your partner is not a project, but a relationship is. You are allowed, required, even, to ask that you both keep building it. The question is whether your requests come from a desire to control or a desire to connect. Margaret said this last, and she said it differently than she said everything else. Slower. She looked at her hands for a moment before she looked at the camera. There were years, she said, where I looked at Roy and I did not feel what I felt at the beginning. And I had to decide, every morning, some mornings, that he was still my person. Not because the feeling was there. Because I chose it. Roy, sitting beside her, did not nod this time. He reached over and covered her hand with his. And for a moment neither of them said anything. This is the most human thing they offered, and it is the most misread. What Margaret is describing is not the absence of love. It is the transition from what psychologists call passionate love to what Robert Sternberg, in his triangular theory of love, identifies as companionate love, a form characterized less by intensity and more by deep commitment, intimacy, and the kind of steady presence that only time can build. Decades of research confirm that this transition is not a failure. It is a maturation. The couples who understand this, who do not interpret the quieting of early intensity as evidence that they have chosen wrong, are the couples who tend to stay, and tend to be glad they did. But here is where we owe Margaret the most careful reading. Decide to Love Anyway is transcendent advice when it describes choosing commitment through the ordinary friction of a long life together. It becomes damaging advice when it is handed to someone whose morning decision to stay is being made inside a relationship that is diminishing them. Margaret is describing an act of devotion. That same sentence, spoken to the wrong person in the wrong room, becomes an instruction to endure. The advice does not know the difference. Only you do. The love that requires a daily decision is not a lesser love. It may be the most mature form of love we are capable of. But that decision must be made freely, with full knowledge of what you are choosing, not under the weight of shame, financial fear, or the belief that choosing yourself is the same as failing. The updated principle: feeling is weather. Commitment is architecture. You do not build a house by waiting for perfect conditions, but you also do not stay inside a house that is collapsing and call it devotion. Here's what I keep returning to, looking at all 5 of these together. Margaret and Roy did not build a great marriage by accepting each other. Not exactly. What they actually built, underneath all 5 of the things they said, running like a current beneath every piece of advice they offered, was a shared story about who they were. A narrative. And they tended that narrative for 61 years. They called it acceptance. But watch what it actually looked like in practice. Roy stopped trying to correct Margaret's way of managing the kitchen, and in doing so, he began to see her competence instead of her difference. Margaret stopped waiting for Roy to become more emotionally expressive, and in doing so, she began to receive the love he was already giving in the language he had. The turning toward, the midnight repair attempts, the daily decision to choose, all of it was, underneath, an act of authorship. They were writing each other into the story of their lives. Generously. Consistently. Over and over again. What modern couples are navigating, and what Harold and Margaret never had to, is a profound disruption to that authorship. We are the first generations building long-term relationships inside an attention economy that is specifically engineered to make your real, present, imperfect partner less interesting than the curated highlight reel of a stranger. We are building commitment in an era when every exit is visible, when the fantasy of a different life is one scroll away, and when the algorithm will absolutely serve you a version of your ex looking happy on a Tuesday afternoon. Roy did not lose Margaret to nothing because he chose nothing. He lost her temporarily to exhaustion, which at least had a natural end. The competition for your attention today does not get tired. We are also the first generations doing this, for the most part, without the scaffolding that held Margaret and Roy's marriage in place from the outside. The church community. The neighborhood that knew you as a couple. The social contract that made leaving feel enormous. You can argue, as I would, that some of that scaffolding was a cage, not a support. But it is worth naming that they were not holding their marriage together through sheer internal will alone. The world around them was also holding it. We are largely on our own. What this means is not that long relationships are harder now, though in some ways they genuinely are. It means that the acceptance Margaret and Roy practiced as instinct, we may have to practice as a discipline. Consciously. With language and frameworks they never needed, because their world did not require them to be this articulate about love in order to sustain it. Call it intentional authorship. The decision not just to accept your partner, but to actively keep writing them, and yourself, into the story with generosity, curiosity, and a willingness to let both of you change without treating the change as a betrayal. That is what 61 years actually looks like, translated. I want to go back to Margaret and Roy one more time. Not to their advice. To them. They have been married for 61 years. They have buried a child. They have sat with each other through diagnoses and layoffs and the specific, quiet grief of watching the world you build your life inside slowly become unrecognizable. And they are still, visibly, glad to be in the same room. That is not nothing. In fact, I'd argue it is one of the rarest things a human being can witness, not passion, not romance, but the deep, withered gladness of someone who chose well and knew it and kept choosing. We cannot pretend their world and ours are the same. That pretense does not honor them, it flattens them. It turns 61 years of specific, complicated, contextual human experience into a greeting card. Margaret and Roy deserve more than that. And so do you. But we also cannot afford to throw away what they found just because the conditions that shaped it no longer exist. What they built was real. The question this video has been asking, from the first minute, is simply, what do we keep, and what do we translate? If you watched this and recognized yourself in Roy's early years, quietly convinced that the person you love needs correcting, that your version of the right way is just objectively the right way, sit with that. Not with shame. With curiosity. Ask yourself what it would feel like to put down the renovation project and actually meet the person standing in front of you. And if you recognized yourself in a different place, and someone who has been told, directly or indirectly, that acceptance means silence, that love means absorbing rather than asking, I want you to sit with something too. Margaret's daily decision to love Roy was made with agency. It was made by a woman who, within the constraints of her world, was choosing. The version of acceptance that asks you to disappear is not what she was describing. Whatever you were told it meant, that is not what she meant. So here is what we carry out of Margaret and Roy's living room, updated for the world we're actually living in. See your partner clearly, not the fantasy, not the project, and then choose them anyway, eyes open. Build toward each other in the small moments, because the distance never announces itself. When conflict comes, repair early, but repair honestly. A resolution you were too exhausted to mean is not a resolution. Ask for what you need without treating your partner's difference as a deficiency. And when the intensity quiets, as it will, recognize it for what it is, not an ending, but an arrival. Keep writing each other into the story. Generously. Specifically. As if the details of who they are still surprise you, because if you're paying attention, they will. I want to know which of those 5 points landed hardest for you, and more than that, I want to know why. Because the why is where the real information lives. Drop it in the comments. And if you have an elder in your life whose relationship advice has always felt slightly off to you, slightly too simple, or slightly too painful to fully accept, bring it here. That is exactly what this channel exists to do. If this way of looking at love and wisdom feels like something you want more of, there's a subscribe button somewhere on this page. Not because the algorithm needs feeding, though it does, but because the conversation we're building here is one that I think is genuinely worth continuing. We are trying to figure out how to love well in a world that makes it harder than it needs to be. That seems worth showing up for. The elders are not wrong. They are just speaking a language that was forged in a different fire, and it is our work, and our responsibility, to translate it before we pass it on.